Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Visualize Your SolarWinds Environment with NetTerrain Automated Network Mapping. My name is Helen Owens-Pope. I am responsible for global marketing here at Loop1, and I will be facilitating things behind the scenes today, hopefully making sure everything runs smoothly. Glenn, if you could advance me onto the next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to run through some quick housekeeping before we get underway today. So today's session is being recorded. Attendees will be muted throughout, but you can submit questions at any time during today's webinar using the Q&A panel in your meeting window. Alternatively, you can send a chat message to me and I'll make sure those get put to today's presenters during our Q&A session toward the end. We are going to be running a poll today. We'll be launching that just before we hand over to our second presenter today. Your participation would be much appreciated, and we'd also really appreciate it if you could give us some feedback at the end of today's session, just to let us know how we did, because that sort of feeds back into our planning for upcoming webinars. Okay, Glenn, if you could advance me on to the next slide, please. So just introducing today's presenters. Some of you may already be familiar with Glenn Kershaw. He's our Director of Sales for the EMEA region here at Loop1. Glenn has been with Loop1, previously Kenson, for 20 plus years. So he's a familiar name to many of you I know on the call today. And Glenn is joined by Jason Sherman, who is a founding member of Graphical Networks and Director of Customer Support. And Jason will be taking care of the main portion of today's presentation and diving into NetTerrain and showing you a demo a little later on. Okay, and with that, I'm hoping that Glenn is winging his way back and is about to join us. Glenn, are you there?
To the audio, can you hear me?
We can now, Glenn, yes.
Thank you ever so much. Apologies there, trying to get the technologies working. So how is everyone? Hope everyone is having a good day. So thank you for joining. Good morning and good afternoon to all that are joining. Just a quick piece on Loop1. Most people will know SolarWinds and Loop1 already, but thank you for organising, Helen, and setting up the webinar. It's great to see so many names that I recognise, some new names, but some names I've been working with for many years. Those who don't know me, my name is Glenn Kershaw, and I'm the EMEA Sales Director here at Loop1. Loop1 are a global VAR and #1 SolarWinds partner with offices in 7 countries, as you can see, with over 120 employees. We mainly work with clients on all of their product requirements, whether that be SolarWinds maintenance renewals, SolarWinds products, and a lot of our enhanced renewals and training services that we do with our clients. I'm really excited to join and host this webinar with Jason at Graphical Networks, which should really showcase how you can visualize your network utilizing your SolarWinds deployment. Have any of you seen what we can do from a SolarWinds services? Well, hopefully you can on this screen here. So if you haven't spoken to your account manager already, book in your rapid report card. If you're not aware what that is, the rapid report card is a 2-hour session powered by Orion Insights, where a Loop1 engineer will work with you to perform the assessment. If you think of this as taking your car in for a minor service, or as you can see there, our health check offering, which is a much deeper dive and would be more like taking your car in for an MOT or major service, giving you much more detailed stats and information on your SolarWinds deployment. And with regard to the SolarWinds services that we can offer, it could be anything from professional service engagement, which would be anything from an ad hoc project or prepaid blocks of managed service hours, or our flagship offering, Lime Services. This is our ITOM Lite and ITOM Plus offering, giving our clients 24/7 managed support services. Loop1 will be responsible for the care and feeding of your SolarWinds deployment. So, documentation. The seminar today is all around how we can utilize and visualize your SolarWinds deployment, or the SolarWinds information you get from there. So some of the best practices for network documentation are on the screen. But before I hand over to Jason, I just wanted to make sure you're aware of some of the things you can see here, and Jason will cover those on the presentation today. Also, to let you know, there will be a free trial available to any customer who wants to download the NetTerrain product. And just need to reach out to your account manager or email sales@loop1.com. That's sales@loop1.com. But again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminar. I'll hand over to Jason now.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate the intro. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending today. Appreciate it. Let me share my screen here. And let me jump over to the PowerPoint and go to the slides here. Let me just scroll down a bit. Some of this you've already seen. As Glenn mentioned, been sort of in the software industry for quite a few years. And most of that has actually been in really network documentation. I was with a company called NetViz many years ago. It's a standalone documentation product. And over the years, they got purchased out and so on. And now for the last, I guess, 10 years or so with graphical networks in our product called netTerrain. So hopefully everybody can see everything on my screen. So I want to give an introduction to netTerrain, kind of talk about some of its capabilities, but more importantly, how it can integrate with SolarWinds and what that kind of means to folks, our existing customers, kind of how they use it and what you can hopefully sort of get out of it as well with respect to network documentation, of course. So a little bit about graphical networks. And before we do that, we're going to do a poll. Besides SolarWinds, how do you document your network? You know, spreadsheets, Visio, both, none. Probably should have put the button other in here. But, you know, there's always different types of ways of folks and how they sort of document their network. So if you guys would just take a minute and kind of roll through that, and I'll keep talking about graphical networks here. So we were founded back in 2009. Realized that there was sort of a good space there, and folks were looking for network documentation tools, software like ours. Visio is a great product. Spreadsheets are a great product. You know, Excel, that type of thing. There's other good tools out there as well. But our focus has always really been on network documentation and how to create documentation, hopefully efficiently and effectively, and automation as well. And I'll certainly be talking about that a bit today. So we're headquartered in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which, you know, you wouldn't necessarily know where that is unless you go to Google Maps. But we're basically right outside of Washington, D.C., sort of a little bit north of Washington, D.C. So we make a product called netTerrain, and it's really for visualizing software, or visualizing really your infrastructure, network, that sort of thing. And I'll obviously show you some of that here in a minute. Many users currently using the software, 10,000 plus, you know, hundreds of customers, big and small, very large organizations, anything from 50,000 plus devices, you know, 500,000 links, etc., down to someone with just a couple racks of equipment and so on. So yeah, good mix. Visio, as expected, quite a few folks using Visio, some spreadsheets, and so on. So it's good to see. It's pretty common. And I mean, of course, there's other tools out there besides Visio. So we can visualize netTerrain. We can focus on things like data centers, the network, just doing logical type or a physical outside plant, etc. So depending on the type of documentation you want to do, usually there's a good fit with respect to netTerrain. Highly customizable, you know, it's very graphical, so it's really kind of driven through that. It's not like a forms engine kind of thing, and that's not to say that's a bad thing. Some people prefer that, and that's not what we do. We really focus on sort of the visual aspects of netTerrain and doing network documentation. So if you go to our website, you'll see a list of different customers. There's a couple listed here, and so on. Bell Mobility, CIBC, Hartford. We're in all different verticals, so there's no one particular area where we have more customers than others. Really, it's really all sorts of customers, because when it comes down to it, it really comes about, you know, do you have a network? Everyone has a network, and do you need to document that? And well, a lot of folks find value in doing network documentation. So there was a chat. I want to make sure. Yeah. So if anybody has questions, feel free to throw it in the chat and so on. So, or the QA, I guess, as well. All right. So I won't spend a lot of time on these slides, but automated documentation is really kind of the end game, hopefully, with respect to network documentation. The issue most folks run into with network documentation is the maintenance of it, keeping it up to date, keeping it where somebody can actually rely on it and know that it's sort of a trusted source of information and data, right? So another customer list, and I'll talk about kind of how to do that. So we're going to jump into the demo now. Let me get out of my slideshow here. So this is netTerrain that I'm in. This is just a demo project. This in no way reflects how a project would necessarily look for a given customer. This is just my project that I use to help present sort of our software. Our software is very hierarchical in that you can start at a high level and work your way down to a lot of detail, like here, where I'm showing actually a map with multiple pathways for fiber cables and so on. And in this particular instance, I'm going into a university campus, showing things like outside plant, which you don't have to do. You know, most of my customers, in fact, probably don't do outside plant. It's more inside plant based or logical based. This is just to show an example of kind of what we can do. So you can do things like show, you know, pictures of buildings and hierarchies of floors and rooms, and get down into things like, hey, I want to see data center, and I want to see, you know, floor plans. I want to see racks and cabinet elevations. Do you have to do all those things? No, absolutely not. The documentation is really kind of up to you and what you want to see and what you want to do. Ultimately, you know, why do you get into doing network documentation? What's the point and the purpose of it? Well, ultimately, you hope it helps you make better decisions, but you also hope it will help you in other ways, like troubleshooting. You know, for instance, if I have a circuit down, I have end users complaining, hey, I got slowness, I have this issue, I got that issue, or I can't even connect. You know, how can I tell, or how will I know how things are connected to understand that part of the network, that network segment? I'm double clicking, by the way, and I'm generating what's called a CLR, and this is a pretty big one, so it may take a second to generate. But good documentation, especially down to the physical level, can show you things like physical connections between ports and show you physical hierarchy. For instance, where a port is with relation to a card and a device and a rack and a floor and a room. Do you need all this? Do you need to do all this? No, it depends on what it is that you want to do and what you want out of your documentation. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to, hey, what is it we really need to help us either troubleshoot a network issue or do things like capacity planning? And when I say capacity, it could be anything from, you know, power, rack space utilization, port utilization, and so on. So there could be many variables there with respect to capacity planning and troubleshooting, et cetera. But with good documentation, you can get into showing different types of, you know, overviews of your network, pathways between points. This is showing me a pathway from a library to a building to the data center, and, you know, how do I get from A to B, so to speak. But also, how do I just find where a device is? I mean, if I have an issue and I need to send a tech out, and I don't have techs all over the world necessary to deal with an issue, or even locally, I want to know where a piece of equipment is, so I'm not sending somebody blind into a situation where they're going to spend hours literally trying to find a piece of equipment. So that's where you get down to, hey, I want to show location, other information. But in addition to, you know, when you talk about network documentation, you might also want to have certain pieces of data available at your fingertips, like, of course, IP addresses and other things, but, you know, maybe maintenance expiration dates so you can run certain reports and so on. Now, other tools are going to give you that, and that's fine, but you might want to leverage that with your network documentation, because when you do look at a project like this and you talk about network documentation, the question always comes up, well, this is great, but this looks like a lot of work. How do I get data into this? How do I make it more automated and efficient? So we're limiting the amount of time we have to spend creating that documentation. And that's where certainly you leverage things like SolarWinds. So here on my screen, I have a LOOP1 training instance of SolarWinds. I am not going to navigate through this because I'm really not in any way a SolarWinds expert. So I'm just showing the sort of the front screen to show you that, hey, there is a SolarWinds instance out there that I'm going to connect to and pull data from. So just a little setup before I get into that is netTerrain is an application that runs either in your environment or it could be a hosted. We do a SaaS platform as well. But how would I connect that to data like SolarWinds data? You know, how would I connect to it, pull that data across, and then push it into a netTerrain instance? Well, we have a tool called the collector, and this is something you can download and install either on the server where SolarWinds is, or your laptop, or really anywhere in the world. I have customers that deploy this collector, or they may say, you know what, I'm just going to run it from one central location, and I'll open up firewall rules, whatever is needed to grab data from a certain system and then pull that data back, right? So the collector is effectively a standalone application. Now it is a Windows application, so it would have to run on a Windows machine, server, desktop, etc. And that's what it looks like, this collector tool. So the collector tool can go out and grab data, and then what it does is it can push that data into a netTerrain server. And you can set up automation and stuff where it's constantly updating and doing other things. I'll talk about that in a second. But this collector you can actually download from a netTerrain instance, or you could have it available, whatever the case may be. But what we're really trying to do here is, of course, leverage information and data that you have in your environment. And SolarWinds is obviously packed full of information about your devices, about the things that you are currently monitoring or discovering, etc., with respect to that tool and what it's doing. So with, for instance, my SolarWinds instance, I can go out and say, I want to collect data from that, connect to it, and pull data through. But I don't want this just to be one time. I want this to be continuous. So when SolarWinds gets a new device or updates information that it finds, I want that just to update my documentation. And that's what this collector can also do for us. So we can go in and set settings. We can set up what's called the scheduler or the poller, et cetera. And this runs as a service, or can be run as a service. And you basically set up how often that happens. And it's really pretty easy to configure too with something like SolarWinds. You're really just putting in a user, a password in, and then the REST API endpoint. Because ultimately, what are we using here? We're using pretty standard things out in software now, which are REST APIs, where we're using the REST APIs from SolarWinds. So it's not like we're having to do any kind of major magic here. It's really saying, hey, we're going to use what SolarWinds provides us. And we all like to provide these APIs. We have our own APIs because we all want to make it so the tools are flexible that we offer. So you can connect to them and pull data and push data and do all these other things, right? So in this case, we have SolarWinds. We have what's called a connector to SolarWinds, and we have different connectors. In fact, you can add more connectors and so on. But in this case, SolarWinds, I have my REST API endpoint, so I specify what that endpoint is, in this case, IP address, and then there's some formatting you do with the rest. You do have to have a user and password in the system that has access to that REST, test the connection, and so on. Now, in addition to setting this up, this is really straightforward. I'm ready to basically pull data. And in this case, I'm pulling really data from two places, the nodes and connections. So if there are connections in SolarWinds, high-level connections, usually these are object to object, and also the nodes themselves, and that's really coming from the SolarWinds nodes table. So, but in addition, you can also go in and do a little bit more advanced things where I can go in and customize. It's an XML file, but you can actually come in here and say, you know what, I want to open up this XML, or I want to do some other things in here, whether I want to enable data or not. But I could come in here and do a SolarWinds query. I can actually limit the data that I bring in. Like in my case, I don't necessarily want to bring in, and it's really easy to do. Again, SolarWinds makes it easy, not only with the APIs, but of course the way you can pull the data and sort of customize the queries that you put in. So in my case, I only want Snmp objects, because you could have ICMP and other things in there, and I don't really need that in my documentation, because they're not really devices. They're just things that you're sort of pinging in that case. So it's pretty flexible from that standpoint. And then once you've configured this, you can point this at a netTerrain server. User password, again, it's using our APIs to push data in. And I'm actually going to push this into my demo project, that one that I was just happened to be showing you a second ago. And then to do a scan, again, you could set this up to pull automatically. I'm going to force the issue by pressing scan. And there you go. It already pulled data. It was that fast, pulled data directly from SolarWinds. Of course, this was a small subset of data. It's just a little lab environment of objects. Here I have nodes and connections. And if I click on nodes, you'll see different information. You'll see different devices, some VMware stuff as well. But I can scroll down through and scroll across and you'll see different data points. In fact, I can open one of these up and kind of see some information about it. And you'll see the system description. And this is all because SolarWinds is, of course, doing its Snmp thing, finding out the device types, getting OIDs, DNS names, IP addresses, and so on, right? And this is all kind of standard stuff that it's polling and that we're bringing across. Okay. With netTerrain, you could further enhance the data that you're capturing by adding additional data fields. You could also gather data from another system and then bring the two together. So there's other things you can do to kind of enhance that and bring more information together as a whole. Okay. So just so you know and you're aware of that. So I'm going to click OK on this. Now, this data currently does not exist in my server, my netTerrain server. All it exists right now is in the collector. All I've done is said, let me pull the data from SolarWinds. It's captured in my collector. I could even save this data, save the data, and then take the data and then load it later. Because I have some customers where they might collect data at a network and they can't actually push data back to netTerrain because they don't necessarily have internet access back to the server for whatever reason, firewall rules. You know, could be security things, etc. So you can actually save the data and then take it and then move it and push it later if you wanted to. So we have this push function. If it can connect to the server, then it starts to load the data, and that's what it's doing here right now. And that does take a minute to push that data through. So we'll let that sort of cook for a second and let it do its thing. And then we'll take a look at kind of what that looks like here as well. So if I go back to my connector here, so you can see you have different connector types you could pull from. So if you're doing something like AWS or Azure or whatever the case may be, you do have options for, you know, gathering data from other data sources and so on. So let's go take a look at this. See if we pushed our data. Scroll down through here. So we're starting to pick up some different data now, and click OK to that. So let me push. When you see blue or white, it kind of starts to tell you that you have data in the system, or if you don't have data in the system, you kind of get this mix of information and so on. So one thing we do is we do have an extensive catalog library of information as well. So let me go back to my netTerrain instance here. I'm going to jump over to like this guy here. This is actually an example of that data being pushed. I'm actually pushing it into a different instance right now. But while that thing's doing its thing, and it only usually takes a minute or two or even less than that to push data. But we do have a pretty extensive library of catalog objects, devices, cards, etc. And one of the things we really try and do is we try and match those devices. So we minimize the time that and effort that you're putting into the documentation. So for instance, we try and mirror the devices that are discovered and match those up to what SolarWinds is finding in the system. And we typically do that based on a system OID of the device. So even if it's not there, you can in fact map devices yourself. So we do make it pretty easy to go through that process of mapping devices. So for instance, if I right click on a device in the collector, I can do what's called a map type and map it to a specific type from the catalog. So it's very easy to do. And again, the reason you do this is you're trying to automate things as much as you can. So as new things are discovered in the network, they automatically appear, the data gets pushed, et cetera, into hopefully your netTerrain instance, and then you can visualize that information. So let me go to the top level on this here for a second. And let's check out. So there's the data that we're pushing. And let me kind of talk through this. Right now, it's doing this thing called processing. It says allowed energy and current energy. No, the question was if it's unknown, will I identify it? No, probably not in that case. If it says it's unknown in SolarWinds, I probably wouldn't know what it is unless the unknown device has an OID. So that's a great question. I mean, I'm really keying off the OIDs of the device. So at that point, I'm sure SolarWinds probably knows what it is. And you're looking at this going, okay, well, what's going on here? Well, this is actually showing you different locations. So something like Cedar Park, Texas, right? Let me go over here to the right and fields. I'll just turn off the link fields for a second. So we're seeing different locations. And this is pretty common, right? You have a location called unknown. You have LOOP1 training, north side. And this is set up this way as an example. So a lot of folks don't take advantage of all the Snmp fields and data that you could put into devices. Of course, that's a time thing, right? You know, a device moves, people forget to update a location and so on. This kind of gives you an idea of the locations you do have, because all these devices, I'm using the location information to tell me, hey, what's at that location? So when I double click, you'll see, hey, this is Cedar Park, Texas, and it's processing the data here. It's going to try and lay things out on the diagram, and I'll get back to that in a second. But if we go and look at, for instance, the data that we actually collected from SolarWinds and we scroll across, you're going to see a location field, right? Because that's directly from the Snmp data, and you have a contact person and so on, and then the netTerrain type as well. But if I jump back to our netTerrain instance here, so this kind of laid things out. What's nice in netTerrain is I can go in and very quickly come down here and say, you know what, let me change the page size of this. And that was a little too small of a page. So let's make it something like A2. There we go. That's better. So, and then I can do things like select all the objects, go back in and relay these out, and it'll space things out, kind of make things nice and neat. And what's nice about this is after you have discovered this data and it lay things out, I mean, you could just have these logical drawings and just rely on those, the flat drawings. You have these connections, so you can see different connectivity that it's brought in between the objects, the devices, and so on. Not everything, because it depends on the device. Again, this is a lab, so it's sort of a mix of things, but I can zoom in and you'll see the device, you'll see the name and other information. In addition, you can have other data fields that you add. If you want to add the serial number in. Now, if the serial number is in the Snmp data, you can set it up where it gathers that as well. Maintenance expiration, of course, that's usually something you bring in from another system, or maybe you have to manually put that type of data in. All these data fields, by the way, on the left-hand side, all user definable. We don't lock you into a certain set of fields. You can add as many fields as you want for a given device type for the most part, and so on. So you can sort of generate these logical views and diagrams and just have those as is if you want to, which is fine. But you can also take these objects and start to move them into the physical hierarchy or other logical drawings and so on. I'll do that in a second. I wanted to comment on this red device down here. You do also have the ability in netTerrain to do things like what's called a visual override, where if the status of this device is 14, then make it red. Well, what does status 14 mean? Well, in SolarWinds, status 14 means that there's something up with this device, because SolarWinds has these different values for status. And I'm just using the SolarWinds status numbers to drive that visual override. I'm sure they have other, more real terminology besides just a status number that you could use as well. But again, that's just kind of show what you might do. Now, as far as the objects, I could literally take an object and cut it and move it and put it somewhere. So if my intent is to take these objects and then start to rack mount them and do something like that, I can certainly do that. I can also take objects and what we call alias them. But as an example, if I cut this object and I'm like, you know what, I really want to put this into its proper sort of data center hierarchy and so on. Well, I could go to an existing network, right? Existing cabinet, let's say, and I could just move the object and say, you know what, I'm going to use my SolarWinds data to discover everything, but then I'm going to document it by putting it into the physical hierarchy based on location and other things, depending on where I want to put it. So if I want to throw it in this cabinet, I can certainly do that. Do you have to? No, of course not. I mean, again, it always comes down to how you want to document things, or what's the end game for what you're really trying to accomplish. So then I can take this and rack mount that device, and now it's actually in a physical location as opposed to and a logical drawing. It still has the connections back. I just don't have them necessarily turned on in this view. The inner diagram connections, which I could turn on. It'll be a little messy, but you can see you can still have those things. I can also take objects in netTerrain, and instead of moving it, because I might want to keep, you know, sort of this view, which I still have this object in this diagram, this logical, we call it a reference object. But I can also take objects and literally move them. Let's say I want to put them in the racks also, but I still want to kind of keep the views that I had. We can do things like what we call aliasing, which means I can place an object with respect to an alias. Let me turn those inner diagram connections off. So there's all different kinds of sort of things you can do within netTerrain, full searching, etc. So, but the power on the tool with respect to certainly back to, of course, SolarWinds is the fact that you are leveraging data that you currently have from that tool. It's already going out and doing work for you, and now you're taking advantage of that to help you build your network documentation. Now, SolarWinds certainly has things built into it. It has a map and some other features and functionality that might satisfy everything you need from a documentation standpoint, which is great. You know, that's good. I mean, you want tools that can obviously maximize, you know, what it is you're doing with that tool, so you don't have to go buy something else. But if you do want a tool network documentation, you want to bring in pieces maybe from other tools, kind of have maybe a central location for documentation, also help automate that, then netTerrain might be a good approach from a network documentation standpoint. So with that said, I'll see if there's any questions. Make sure I didn't ignore anything. And if you have questions, comments, please let me know. Happy to talk a bit more about our product, or of course, if you have questions about SolarWinds, I can't help you there, but somebody else I'm sure could. Let's see here. Yeah, so there was a question that said, you know, can I identify an unknown product? No, because as I mentioned, what we really identify is directly from SolarWinds, and it's based on the SolarWinds data that it's found. So if it has an OID, I can probably identify it, but chances are if it has an OID, SolarWinds knows what it is anyway. But is netTerrain able to perform native monitoring with Snmp or ping monitoring devices independently from SolarWinds? To a certain extent, yes. We do Snmp, you know, gathering of data. We can do discovery. It's not going to be extensive as SolarWinds, and ping to a certain extent, but again, not as extensive. It's not really a monitoring tool. That's not what we're geared towards. It's really, for us, it's about the visualization of, you know, network documentation, gathering data, and so on, and leveraging the tools that you have. So anyway, any other questions? I will mention too, because a lot of folks typically ask, you know, how are we hosted? I did mention we do have a cloud version of netTerrain. In fact, you can get 14-day trial of that. So I would talk with LOOP1 if you're interested in kind of checking that out. We can certainly accommodate that, and, you know, certainly answers any questions. So if you do have more detailed questions, I would talk to a LOOP1 rep, and they can certainly help you out. And also, you know, so we do host it, but we also do internal. So most of my folks, customers, really host their own servers. We do a few SaaS for sure, but most folks like to have that kind of data internally. Yeah.
Questions here, Jason, have come through. Just to cover off the licensing, really, how is netTerrain licensed? I mean, you mentioned there's a hosted offering. What other options do we have?
Yeah, so hosting, yeah, from a licensing standpoint, whether it's internal or hosted, pricing's pretty similar. I think the SaaS is probably a little bit more expensive and slightly limited in that it's more user count involved in a license, where read-only users, I think, when you host it yourself, is unlimited, because we're not responsible for the hardware at that point. So, so just so you know, but yeah, I mean, licensing, it's pretty flexible. For the most part, it's based on objects and object counts. And when we say objects, it's pretty much think in terms of servers, switches, routers, that type of thing. We don't license for links. We don't license for ports. We try and keep the licensing somewhat straightforward. So you just think in terms of the number of devices you have, and for the most part, that'll be your license count. Yes, there are a couple of things you have to include. Usually hierarchy objects like a building, or if you have multiple buildings, that'll include, but that's almost a very small percent of what your typical license count will be. So that's kind of what you sort of look at from a licensing standpoint. And costs, I mean, as far as costs go, I think if you look at something like the SaaS version of the software, for like 250 objects and 2 users, it's like $100 a month. So it starts pretty small, cost wise. But if you have a lot of devices, then really you have to talk to one of your sales reps, and they can give you a better idea of costing. So
fantastic, thank you. And just to confirm the database that netTerrain will run on.
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you are hosting it yourself, we are a Windows platform, so you got to host on a Windows server and a SQL Server database. It doesn't have to be a standalone SQL. You can use an existing SQL farm, or you can use, another SQL instance. It could be local, it could be separate, it could be separate from the application, I should say. I do have a lot of folks that use SQL Express, so depending on the size and implementation, if it's not a lot of concurrent users, SQL Express usually works pretty well. So.
Fantastic. One more come through. Can you pull data from multiple sources? So not just from SolarWinds, so for any one project?
Yeah, and we can do that through the collector or through something called the ITK, which I didn't talk about. But so from the collector, pretty much any system I can connect to if they have pretty robust APIs, because even if I don't have an existing connector, we can typically build a connector depending on what it is. And, we'd have to talk to you about it. But things like Azure and AWS and of course, SolarWinds and ServiceNow seems to be a lot of interest now in ServiceNow. Folks connecting with that seems to be a big deal. So that's all good. And then we can also even connect to data sources, database tables, views, things like that. That's where what we call the ITK comes into play. And these are all things that are part of netTerrain. We don't license separately for like the collector. Anybody can use the collector that has a license for netTerrain, basically. So same with the ITK, although you have to really host that yourself. And what else? Yeah, so we can pull data from lots of sources. We also have an extensive REST API ourselves. We have a few customers that use that to really develop their own interfaces to their own data so they can automate their own creation of network documentation in their own way. So they use our APIs for that.
Fantastic. I think there's one other question just coming around the Snmp again. So can a native Snmp monitoring on netTerrain pull information like connectors, ARP tables, etc.?
Yeah, with our native Snmp discovery, we do ARP and we do layer 2 and layer 3 CDP, LLDP, and things like that. You may find it a little redundant with SolarWinds. I don't know the extent of SolarWinds and what they pull as far as connections. So you could do it where you have sort of you pull your SolarWinds devices and then you enhance that with, maybe doing some CDP or LLDP if it's not already coming from SolarWinds. So yes, you can grab additional information.
And I guess this is more from my perspective, without putting you on the spot, Jason, because I know you get involved with a lot of the project works that you do.
Yep.
I mean, have you got any sort of current use cases that customers have used, whether it be SolarWinds or any other tool, to integrate into netTerrain and the benefits they've got? We saw the slide that had the sort of features and the benefits, which are pretty generic. Is there any sort of specific use cases that stand out for yourself where customers have seen great value in integrating with SolarWinds or other tools?
Yeah, SolarWinds. I've had a few customers do SolarWinds. No one I can mention specifically, only because I'm not allowed to mention them. But yeah, we've had a few SolarWinds integrations, and they're mainly successful from the standpoint of the automation side, where they're already, like I mentioned, doing the discovery with SolarWinds. They already have data. They just want to bring that data over and visualize it because they want to do more physical connections and show things obviously physically in a hierarchy and do all these other things that that allow them to, get more detailed documentation about their network. That's true for ServiceNow too. I have a really good implementation right now with ServiceNow, and it's the same kind of thing where, they have users putting data into that system. I don't really claim to know much about ServiceNow, but it's obviously a big sort of asset management CMDB type repository of information. So they're leveraging all their devices again to show where they are in racks and inside their network, so they can better manage and understand where all the equipment's located. And then at some point they may add additional things like the connectivity and so on. But that one was more asset location, things like that. So those are two
And I guess
examples.
And I guess your connectors are taking away the requirement to know that knowledge, right? Because the connector will do all the clever piece for you, right?
Yeah, I mean the connectors, right? It's already pulling the data, and if you have good data in your device, your SNMP data like location, who's in charge of that device, and other things too, then we can grab that information and bring it straight over to netTerrain. And if SolarWinds gets other OID information, other values from the devices, I don't know if it pulls in power and temperature and other things from devices, but if it does, then you can leverage that too, because really any data that's collected from one of those tools, you can really bring over and bring that in. So
yeah, so I think there's a follow-up to that. Thank you. Is it possible to make maps of devices that are inside VRF?
You'll have to, I'm not familiar with VRF, so
Yeah,
someone will have to tell me what the VRF
yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If we can have
It
that
sounds
clarified,
very
you asked that.
technical, and I probably don't know it. It's probably some technology I'm not aware of yet. But
No worries. We'll look into that one if we can and get back to
yeah.
whoever asked that question.
Yeah.
Can it integrate with the Orion Maps? I think the customer's obviously looking to see whether they can start pictorially showing what netTerrain can do within SolarWinds, I guess, so traverse of what we're talking about now.
So the only thing I've really seen with respect to sort of pulling data back from netTerrain into SolarWinds, and this may not be exactly the question you're asking, but we do have a sort of a dynamic search, which allows you to do things like in SolarWinds, you could have a field that you click on that takes you to the object directly in the netTerrain. So you take you pass something down into our dynamic search, like the DNS name, we look it up and take you straight to that object in netTerrain. Now you can do the reverse too. SolarWinds has dynamic search, where you go from the object in netTerrain, you click on a link that takes you directly to your SolarWinds instance and takes you to that page that kind of gives you all the data about that device. You can do that as well. I think SolarWinds has that where you can do a dynamic search through the URL.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. I guess I think that the question was around if in the rack views that you were showing within netTerrain, could we show that within SolarWinds?
Only as well. Yes and no. So everything. So again, if you were in SolarWinds, you could click on something and it will take you directly to the rack, in other words, or to that device where it's located in netTerrain. Visually, I couldn't show you the rack, the netTerrain inside SolarWinds. I don't think that capability would be there, but certainly being able to navigate from SolarWinds to a rack very quickly in netTerrain, that should not be an issue.
Yeah, I think again, the VRF is the virtual routing and forwarding.
Yeah.
So we'll take that one off offline.
I will throw that out as probably a no, since I've never really heard of it before.
We'll look into that one. And just again, it seemed really easy to do what you did with the integration work there. So let's say we take a typical mid-size customer. What sort of timeframes would it look to take SolarWinds database or hook into database to show it in SolarWinds, to show it in netTerrain for a typical mid-size? And I know we're speculating a lot here, but just to give an idea and a feel,
okay.
What's the sort of timescales required to do that?
To literally connect to SolarWinds and push it into netTerrain, you're probably talking about 15 minutes, because you download the collector, you install the collector on a Windows machine. As long as you have a user that has access to the SolarWinds API and you know where your SolarWinds system is, and you can connect to it from the collector connector, as long as all that stuff's in place, connecting to the SolarWinds data and pulling the data in is just what I did basically, except I didn't show you how to install the collector or download it, right? So that's literally could be minutes to pull the data, push it into netTerrain. Again, you have a netTerrain instance running, user and password. You're pushing data. It probably takes 5 minutes to push the data if it's a pretty large set, and you're ready to sort of visualize. Now, that's not to trivialize from the standpoint of there's more work to do, right? I mean, you're going to get data in. You're going to find, hey, this device doesn't look exactly like a Cisco device from the netTerrain catalog. So you might have to go back to the collector and do what's called a mapping, where you right click and say, okay, this is this device type. Because the OIDs, I don't necessarily have them all, or they don't match up for whatever reason. Someone had mentioned, the OID isn't always necessarily identified. So you might have to do a little work there. But I would say, spend a couple hours and you're going to have a pretty good view of your SolarWinds data and information, and you will have cleaned it up and probably put it into some nice looking diagrams at that point. So you're not talking about
it's not
a
days and
team
weeks,
of,
right? Yeah.
No, definitely not. You're not talking about you need a team of, engineers or something to get this thing running and set up. In fact, to test it out for anybody, it's very easy because we do offer this SaaS platform where you can sign up, download the collector. You could then connect to your SolarWinds, push data into the instance, and kind of check things out if you want to that way. So,
and I'm guessing the time could potentially be in, depending on the client, how much effort they want to put in, right? Because the data, the information is going to be there. It's then how well you want to make it look, how automated, and if you want to connect into any other systems AD or ServiceNow, as you said, Service Desk. So I guess that could then add some time. But yeah, the fact that you say sort of hours, that's impressive.
Yeah, it should not take long to connect and push data into netTerrain. That should be relatively quick. Yeah, clean up diagrams and then deciding, okay, well, what's our end game here? Is it to create rack elevation views? Am I going to put things into the racks? Do I even know where these things are with respect to the racks? Because if on the front side in SolarWinds, if you don't know where the rack is, you don't know where rack it goes into, if you don't know who owns it, if you don't know the location and other things, then that becomes time consuming because you have to clean up your data a bit and say, okay, well, this thing's in Austin, Texas, as opposed to unknown, right? So you go through, but for me, I view that as value. I view that as, I want to know where those things are, and I want to know what's really missing from my total network as far as all my tools and documentation. But that's me. It's easy for me to say too. I make a network documentation product, so.
How typically would netTerrain sort of pull and get the sort of latest updates?
Mm-hmm.
How up to date would is that a manual setting typically?
You set it, you can set it and forget it. So you can go in and say, I want to set up this thing to do the collector to do a poll every 24 hours, every day, every 5 minutes, getting new data, fresh data, and pushing that automatically, because we can run as a service wherever you install the collector. And then it can just be set up where it just runs on a regular basis and does this pull and push of data. So it connects to SolarWinds, gets new data, updates the data in netTerrain, and it's all seamless from that standpoint.
So then really you only need the one source of truth from that example that SolarWinds needs to be up to date. What about if you wanted to push the other way? Could you do that from within netTerrain?
Currently we don't. It's not that you can't, but when you want to start pushing data back from, let's say, something like my tool into another tool, it's not that we can't, because there's APIs for doing that, certainly with SolarWinds as well. We're very emphatic about knowing the requirements of pushing data back and what you want to have happen, because the last thing you want is to have a system, whether it's mine or anybody's, corrupting or doing something that was unexpected. So do it, absolutely. Yeah, but we always have, in those cases, those are always, let's sit down and do a requirements meeting and that sort of thing. So not a big deal.
Fantastic.
Can be done. It's all there. It's just, that's where we put the stop sign up.
Yeah, I seen a question come in. Again, it may be one for us to go back on. What's your knowledge with regards to Cisco DNA?
Not much. I mean, what I say about any system, truthfully, is whether it's Cisco DNA, which I assume is probably like their Cisco Prime or one of those other tools. I might be totally off the mark. For us, it's all about APIs. If you want to pull data from any system, whether it's Cisco DNA directly or SolarWinds or anything, the first thing we always look at is, okay, what do you want to pull out of DNA? And let me look at the documentation and see if there's APIs. If there are, which I can almost guarantee there would be, then we can pretty much pull any data you want from those systems to create documentation for you, is what it really comes down to. So.
And is there any limit to the number of sources you could pull from?
Yeah. Nope. Not that I've hit. You know, it really comes down to where you install the collector and if it does have access to those systems. And of course, it has to be, the more systems you're pulling data from, the more robust the machine's going to have to be to handle all the data sort of flowing in, flowing out. But no. And in fact, you could have collectors installed on different, you know, different machines, that one pulls SolarWinds and one pulls Cisco DNA and one pulls ServiceNow, and you know, you can divide them up as well. So.
And if there's any clients or customers on here who don't currently have SolarWinds but have spreadsheets or whatever, again, we could utilize that, right?
Yeah, we have a very robust Excel import process. So we have a format you follow. You just take your data, sort of put in that format. It's not very complicated format, but you can build a whole network documentation, hierarchy, et cetera. You can even do updates with Excel import as well. So yeah, it's very good Excel import, in my opinion. So.
Okay. Oh, I think there's one there. If there are multiple data sources, are there any precedence rules that control which source updates data fields?
Well, certainly if you happen to be using the same field for two data sources, the last person that updated wins, because it's going to be trying to update the same. But you can say, even if they technically had shared sort of the same field data, you can in one data source say, you know what, this field I'm not going to map over to netTerrain from this data source, but in this data source I will map it. So you're basically saying, hey, this is the one that is really going to bring me the data I care about for that particular piece of data. So you can decide, you know, where the data is coming from for each data source and which fields each piece of data basically ties into to determine that. Hopefully you're not using the same, you know,
Yeah,
for
and
data sources.
I just double check. I'm not sure whether you covered that with regards to some of the other bits that netTerrain can do outside what I think we discussed with fiber plant monitoring. Is it worth just touching on that one for a second?
Sure. I mean, we do. Yeah, it's been certainly very popular as of late, is outside plant. So fiber plant. That doesn't have to be just outside, so to speak. But when I say OSP, I think in terms of fiber cables, fiber strands. If you are documenting any of those things, or you need to, you do want to do fiber cables and strands down to the port and be able to track those things. We do certainly have the ability to do that. It's our outside plant module. I have quite a few customers, seen a lot of universities that are documenting their fiber, airports, a couple other sort of verticals. I've seen kind of the interest has peaked quite a bit for whatever reason. And that's because, you know, folks have these large networks, lots of buildings, lots of infrastructure between buildings, doing splicing, or maybe you're not doing splicing, but you really need to know how many cables or strands you have. And you also need to know if strands are already tied up with other, in other circuits and other sort of, have been dedicated to some other process, so you can capacity plan on your fiber strands, and we can help you with all those things. We have algorithms that can calculate, you know, pathways and which strands to use, and also you can assign those to a dedicated circuit ID, circuit name, and it can consume those strands. So then you can better capacity plan on, you know, what you do actually have available in your environment. So it's a great question.
I think with a lot of the security things that have gone on in the past, and I think there was even one today where the internet was down for many providers. So I won't mention any names, but do you think documentation now actually, it's really becoming more of a security play, right? Because you've got to know where it is, what
Yeah.
you've got, how it's hanging,
Yeah.
how it's connected. So I guess it's new to me from years ago, where selling sort of netTerrain, but I think it does play it really is coming into the security piece now.
Again, I'm heavily biased here, but I don't know how anybody manages a network without some decent documentation, even if it's high level, showing me core connections between my carriers and my core routers internal to my buildings. Even if it's just that sort of high level stuff, I don't know how you live without some sort of documentation, whether it's detailed or not. To me, how do you secure a network if you don't even know what you have, where it is, all these other things that come into play? Of course, SolarWinds helps you with a lot of that stuff. But, from a physical connectivity and also, again, troubleshooting, I just, to me, I just don't understand how you can, especially these large networks. I mean, when you talk about a vendor or a customer that has literally, 500,000 connections and 50, 60, 100,000 pieces of equipment, I know you use a lot of tools to help manage that, but without documentation, I don't know how you really get a really good handle on how your network is laid out. So it's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think again you highlighted with the SolarWinds, if SolarWinds is doing a lot of that work, and customers have spent the time, effort, and resources into having SolarWinds monitoring their network, then they've done most of the work already. Really, it's just them getting that connector and then having the view come into netTerrain, which I think again takes it deeper than what SolarWinds can offer already.
Yeah, and of course, it always comes back to the end user, the customer saying, do I have a pain in this area with respect to, as it helping to troubleshoot or helping to determine capacity and all these other things, And if you do, then maybe we're the right fit. Maybe we're not. There's a lot of other tools out there for sure, and some of them are very good for sure. So you just want to, see which one would be best. But we do try and automate this and make this very easy for the end users with respect to bringing data from, tools that you have. Certainly, of course, SolarWinds, as you said, the data is already there. It's just leveraging more the visual side of things, and maybe integrating with some other tools as well.
Fantastic. Not sure if there are any other questions there now. I think we've answered most of them. I'll just double check quickly.
Yep.
I think that's what we have there. So I guess from my perspective, for anyone on the webinar, thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Jason, for presenting and going through a very detailed run through of what netTerrain can offer. Again, certainly to our SolarWinds customers there to make use of what you're already doing. And if anyone has any questions, certainly reach out to the poll. We will send out a questionnaire, I think, afterwards for just to get some feedback. And again, anything honest feedback there will be good. If anyone wants to take a deeper dive, we can arrange online demos to go through specific requirements you may have. Or there is how many days did you say, Jason? Sorry, trial?
14 days.
14-day trial. So anyone can download a 14-day trial. But again, thank you very much for attending. I'd like to wish you all a good rest of the evening and afternoon, wherever you are. And again, thank you, Helen, for hosting and sorting.
Not a problem. Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you very much, Jason. And just a quick reminder to everyone, if you can please complete the survey at the end. It should pop up in your browser window when you exit the webinar.
Thanks all.
Thanks everybody for your time. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.